Hello everyone, welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about confined operations. How do I get into a tight space? Which is something that helicopters are ideally suited for. First things first, whenever you're going into a confined area, the best thing to do is do your homework before you get there, right? A pilot is always supposed to have all available information pertinent to their flight. And if you crash, they might say, well, you didn't do enough planning. The best thing to do if you're going to go into a confined area, if you can do it, is to do some ground reconnaissance. So what does that mean? That means that you go to this location beforehand, you look at any obstacles that are around there, you have a very good idea of the elevation of this place, so you don't have to guess when you're coming in on an approach. And that is the best situation. Now, that's not always possible. And in the cases where it's not possible, it's recommended that you do a high reconnaissance and a low reconnaissance. So what's the high reconnaissance? High reconnaissance, you're trying to determine things like the speed of the wind, where are you going to touch down? Is it suitable? What are going to be your approach and departure paths? What are the obstacles for both the approach and the departure? And what are you going to do if you have some sort of an emergency? What's your out, if you will? A lot of people have different acronyms they like to use for confined operations. I like to use WOPS, and that stands for winds, obstacles, path, in and out, and that includes your escape path if something goes wrong, power, and suitability. So let's go through those one by one. So winds. If you're lucky, there will be some sort of wind direction indicator at your destination. However, that's not always going to be the case. There might not be a windsock right next to it. So what are you going to do? Well, there are a couple things you can do. If there's water nearby, you can look at the ripples on the water and see the direction of the wind from that. There are trees nearby. Can you see the branches blowing in the wind? That is going to give you another indication of what's going on. Barring that, if your helicopter has a GPS, you can fly around in a circle and look at your ground speed. And you can see when your ground speed is greatest, you're flying downwind. Will tell you the direction of the wind. Now, of course, there's a caveat for that. It's assuming that the winds are the same on the ground as they are at whatever altitude that you're doing this. Typically, we'll say to do your high reconnaissance at 300 to 500 AGL. So it's probably fairly close. Not going to be exact. If you don't have a GPS, you can try to fly a constant bank angle circle around your point and then just observe the drift that you're going to get. So that's W, winds. O, obstacles. There's a lot of hidden obstacles that you can't see up high. Power lines, other wires, guy wires holding things up. These are all potential threats to you and your helicopter. So you want to do your best to try to see these things. And normally they'll say that if you're at about a 45-degree angle, it is the best for estimating things like the heights of these obstacles and such. Okay, path in and out plus your escape path. You're going to fly into your destination. Are you going to be able to approach directly into the wind? Or are you going to have to deal with a crosswind? You definitely, if you can at all avoid it, you don't want to land with a tailwind. You may be able to come in with some sort of a crosswind. What's your abort plan? Let's say you're coming in and you're like, ooh, this is not working out. What am I going to do? What is your path back to safety? What if you have an engine failure? You're probably not going to adhere to that HV diagram during this approach. You want to spend the minimum amount of time outside of that diagram that you can. Power. Do I have enough power to touch down safely at this destination? Do I have enough power to hover, in other words? How do you know if you have enough power or not? Depends on the helicopter you're flying. If you're flying a Schweitzer, of course, it's not D-rated in any way, like some other helicopters are, such as the Robinsons, which are derated by the pilot. So there's that, but you don't want to get to the bottom of this flight and pull power and figure out you don't have enough. So what can you do to test that? Well, you could try to do an out-of-ground effect hover, say a few hundred feet above your touchdown point. And if you can hover out-of-ground effect at that altitude, you're probably going to be okay with an in-ground effect hover a couple hundred feet lower. So that is a way that you can check for power. And what about suitability? Yes, suitability of your landing point. Is it actually going to be, it should be, is it a soft surface? Are you going to sink into it? Is there a bunch of dirt or snow covering it? Are you going to have a whiteout or a brownout when you get down low? These are the kinds of things you need to think about. And also, is there slope? A slope that's too great for you to land on it. Make sure that you have a suitable place to land. We talked about WAPs, we talked about your high reconnaissance. Of course, your low reconnaissance is, practically speaking, going to be part of your approach. You're going to do a high reconnaissance. You're going to look at the area and try to determine, hey, is this going to be okay or not? And then you're going to want that low reconnaissance, which will most likely include approach to your landing point. It just gives you another chance to find anything that you missed, any poles, towers, wires, slopes, things like that you may have missed. And you, of course, want to make your decision to land or not before you get below ETL speed. Typically, you're going to want to terminate your approach into a hover so that you can check that surface and make sure that it's actually going to be okay to land on before you actually lower it to the ground. And of course, when you lower it to the ground, you're going to proceed with caution, as always. Here is a place I've chosen to do some confined areas. This is in X-Plane 11 again, and I'm at the helicopter parkour airfield, EDX2. Here I am, and let's have a look around at the place I'm going to land. So if you look, you'll see here that I have a nice tall fence. So I've got a tall fence, and if I come around this way, I still have that tall fence, and you'll see that I have this big tower, this big red and white tower. So I need to be careful if I were to approach from that direction. And here, more tall fence. Have a couple of covered spaces. And then I have a tower over here. I have some trees. I have a dolly. Now, I could say I want to land on this dolly. I would recommend against that, right? In general, there could be exceptions to everything. If you have these tall obstructions all around your place that you're going into, personally, I would say aim for the middle and then taxi to wherever it is that you want to go from there. Another tower. And out this way, things are a little bit clearer. I have a couple of pinnacles that I can do my practice landings on. And there's the rest of this little airfield that I can use for practice. So that is the place that I'm going to come in here and try to do my approach. Okay, so I'm going to do my high reconnaissance here. So what I'm doing in this case is I'm just flying around my point. I'm trying to determine things such as the wind, any obstacles. And this is what I'm seeing. All right, so this is my space from the side. and you'll see that I've got my pinnacles here. And for the purposes of this exercise, I'm going to pretend that this fence also extends into this area. So I'm going to have to make an approach over the fence or over this area where I have multiple towers and the fence, or over these trees, and there's also a tower here. So what does that leave me with? That's essentially going to leave me with pretty much approaching this direction. I mean, I can either approach this direction or approach this direction over my pretend fence, because there are towers on these two sides. So which direction do I want to choose? Well, that can depend on things such as what is the wind doing? And in the case of this helicopter, it does have a GPS, so I might use that in order to determine the direction of the wind. All right, so now I'm looking at our ground speed primarily. So I don't want to be coming in with a direct tailwind, so instead I'm going to come over through the practice area, if you will, over my fake fence and approach that way. So what does that mean? I'm going to have a left crosswind. Of course, if I had to choose, I would prefer to have a right crosswind, but it is what it is. And I'll just have to accept that little bit of wind. So let me go ahead and complete my high reconnaissance. I want to start planning my path in and out. We just said, okay, I'm going to come in over the rest of the practice area, if you will. And what's my abort plan? If I have to abort, I will fly out over the other fence, the one that's actually there. Okay, so let me go ahead and continue. So now I'm going to do my high reconnaissance. I'm flying around in my circle, and I'm watching the difference between my indicated airspeed and between my ground speed. So right now I see that there's a pretty big difference, kind of going downwind. Now there's very little difference, probably crosswind. I've determined that I have a crosswind that is exactly opposite to what I would prefer here. I would prefer if the crosswind was from the front, right? I want to land into the wind if I can. And it looks like the wind is blowing in such a direction that I cannot land directly into the wind because it's on the two sides of my little square here that both have towers to deal with. and that's a little bit much. So what am I going to do instead? I'm going to come in over the practice area here at my little airfield. And remember, I'm going to pretend that 100-foot fence extends to that practice area as well. And I'm going to come in and I'm going to try to do a steep approach into the middle of my area. Now, when I get down to the bottom of it, I can always turn into the wind once I've cleared my obstacles, and I probably will do that before I come in and land. So let's go ahead and continue our approach. A little bit, and we're going to try to show you a better perspective of our reconnaissance. So here I'm looking at my ground speed. You can see that I'm starting to go downwind. into the wind at this point. So if I were to fly this path, it would bring me right over all those trees and between those two towers, which obviously is not something that I want. And as I come around, you'll notice that my ground speed is still pretty low. I'm still indicating 60 knots on my airspeed. So what is this telling me? Well, I could also try to approach between the two towers on this corner, on this side of my little triangle. Or not a triangle, it's a square. And that's probably not what I want. So my options are to come in on the straight in path over that fence, which would be a direct tailwind, or I could come in over my little practice area here, if you will, and that would give me a better situation. I'd have a left crosswind, but it could be worse. Just wanted to give you another perspective on that reconnaissance and trying to figure out the winds, because it's a little hard if you're only seeing in front of you in order to do this. So of course, real helicopter, it's easier. It's also a little bit difficult for me to try and fly when I'm only looking out the side window too. So that is pretty much all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it.